she made it. She braved the floods and got here on time. And I've already given you some introductory material about Dr. Anna Greenberg, and we are delighted for her to come and speak on examining old issues in the culture war, social issues, religion, and the 2012 election. Welcome. Can we get your coffee?
Okay, thank you. Hi. Well, I know I'm the last session, so I hope that you're still awake and interested. It was a little bit of an odyssey getting here, but I'm very pleased to be here. And, you know, there's no better place to talk about religion and culture wars than Texas, though I am going to. But I actually am primarily going to talk about national data, not Texas data, and I can try, from some of the work I've done for Texas Freedom Network, to talk about Texas, but this is mostly focused on the sort of national environment. So what I thought I would do today, I was sort of tasked with talking about what they called the old issues in the culture wars, which I thought was sort of interesting. So I put old in quotation marks, because it's true in some sense these issues are old because they've been with us for a long time, especially abortion. LGBT issues, I think, are with us relatively, more recent, really the 90s. But in some ways they're not old because they still are very important part of our elections and our political discussion. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the way attitudes have changed over time on LGBT issues and abortion and the kind of role that it's played in electoral politics, and then talk a little bit about religion and politics in the upcoming 2012 election. I know John Green already had some discussion with you about that, so there might be a little bit of overlap, but hopefully not too much. So let me just start. Let's see. So the first point I would make is that I think social issues, play a small but important role in elections generally, and certainly in the 2012 election. And every year, because this is something that I do and John does, we're always asked, what kind of role did religion play, in the past election? And if you look at voting patterns, and I'll show you some of them, and I think John did too, they don't change that much from year to year. But these social issues do, I think, even if it's indirect, play a pretty important role. They don't drive national elections per se, but they're really important indicators of the values that different candidates hold, and they're really important heuristics for voters when they're trying to figure out who to support. And they end up, and I can talk a little about the 2010 elections, but there's some pretty important races, Senate races, congressional races, and other ballot initiatives where these issues actually played a pretty important role, even if they weren't kind of driving either the congressional elections in 2010 or the presidential election in 2008, and I think the same thing will be true this year as well. At the same time, these people's views on these issues are changing, and they're changing in really interesting ways. So if you look, for example, at LGBT issues broadly defined, and I'll show you the data, we're getting almost to a point of national consensus on LGBT issues, at least as expressed in public opinion polls. There's lots of latent homophobia that people don't express to pollsters or in focus groups because they know it's socially unacceptable, so I'm not suggesting that homophobia no longer exists. But when you look at public opinion over time, what people are saying to pollsters has been changing on LGBT issues, and we're nearing a consensus on all issues except for marriage. But even on marriage, we're approaching a 50-50 split. And I think that you'll see, and I think you hear it actually in important evangelical leaders, for example, talking about the fact that LGBT issues have kind of a shelf life for them, that they aren't the same driver of their politics the way, say, abortion is. And abortion, actually, what's interesting about abortion is not so much that opinion has changed on abortion. In fact, opinion on abortion is incredibly stable. What's interesting about abortion is the different ways, particularly the pro-life movement has found different ways to engage with the issue. And I mean, the most recent examples would be the personhood amendments, which I'll talk about later in the presentation. So, both LGBT issues in the sense that views are changing about them, and I think that the Christian right is viewing those issues as not as helpful to them for mobilization purposes, for example, of evangelical voters. And abortion remains a core kind of critical issue for the right, but the way they're trying to deal with the issue is changing. And then the final point, and I made earlier, is that religious differences are critical to understanding elections in this country. You can't really understand why people vote the way they do if you don't look at the role that people's personal religiosity plays and how it intersects with some of these issues, with abortion, with LGBT issues, and a range of other social issues. But and the country remains polarized along these lines, and I think will remain polarized for the foreseeable future, though I think younger people are different. This generation, millennials and Gen Y, are different than previous generations, and over time, as this generation becomes, the bulk of this country, it's a generation that is as big as the baby boom generation. You may start to see some changes in the way religion divides our electorate. One thing, though, that is interesting is that if you look at religious groups and the way people sort themselves, it's pretty polarized except for Catholics. And I think Catholics are a really interesting group to talk about in a little more detail because it's a group that actually is quote-unquote swing and has been swing in the last 3 or 4 elections. But there's also some really interesting changing dynamics in the Catholic community, particularly with the growth of the Hispanic population. And again, that's an issue I think that's quite relevant here in Texas. So those are the things I'm going to talk about today. Let me start by going through the data. Let me start by going through some of the trends on a whole range of LGBT issues, but starting with relationship recognition, which has been really the hardest issue for the LGBT rights movement. You can see here on the question of civil unions, whether or not people favor or oppose allowing gay and lesbian couples to enter into legal agreements that would give them the same rights as married couples. You can see that over time, support has been growing for civil unions or domestic partnerships, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't really matter actually how you word it, whether you call it civil unions or domestic partnerships. And we're at the point of being close to 60% of people supporting civil unions. And there are, in different states, the results are obviously different, but there are plenty of states where you have near consensus, 70, 80% of people in states supporting, domestic partnerships or civil unions. And to me, what's so interesting about it is first, how rapid the change has been. I mean, if you just look, this chart alone is only 2003 to 2008. That's 5 years. Public opinion changes very slowly over time on kind of core values issues, and the rapidity of the change is really astonishing. And if you may or may not recall, when the first state that passed civil unions was Vermont, and Howard Dean signed that bill, people actually lost their seat. People who voted for the civil union bill in Vermont were turned out of office. That's how kind of controversial the kind of upheaval around Vermont doing that. Now it's actually the conservative position, to be for civil union domestic partnership as opposed to marriage equality. And then if you look at the marriage question, you can see here that over time we're seeing the same sort of pattern that we saw on civil unions. We still have, a plurality, or depending on the poll, maybe a bare majority on average against marriage equality, but we are at the point where the country is evenly divided on the question of marriage. And again, what's interesting about this is the time frame. This chart starts in 1985 and goes down to the most recent period. And you can see, if you look at the dots, let me try and use this pointer thing. You can start seeing how much polling is actually happening on the question, starting in around 2003, 2004, and that's about when the right started to use constitutional amendment fights at the state level to try to, mobilize, evangelical voters to come out to vote. They were using the marriage amendments as a vehicle. Now, one problem for the right on marriage amendments is there actually aren't a lot of states left. In other words, most of the states where it's pretty easy to pass an amendment against gay marriage have already passed them. Thank you. It's coffee. It's been a long day. But so there isn't much more room to do this, but it's also interesting to note that when that work started, progressives and the gay rights movement were very nervous about this issue. And in fact, I was engaged to do a project by HRC, Human Rights Campaign, in 2004, to do a defensive project on the role that gay marriage played in the 2004 presidential election, so that when Kerry lost, we could say, see, it wasn't gay marriage. And literally it was 6 months before the election. Like, we don't want gay marriage to be blamed for Kerry losing. What was interesting about that was our research showed pretty decisively that it was about Iraq and security and trust and strength, and ironically, given Kerry's record as a veteran, that really drove Bush winning that election, and also some underlying issues. But the exit polls that year had a question about what was the most important issue in the election, and there was really only like one conservative category on it, and it was moral values. So many of the conservative-leaning voters, instead of saying the economy or healthcare or Social Security, said moral values. And so a narrative that came out election night was that the 2004 election was about moral values. So our work for HRC to prove that it wasn't gay marriage that lost the election for Kerry was kind of obliterated by the exit polls and that whole conversation. But at any rate, this is, you know, pretty astonishing to see this kind of movement, and I expect it to keep happening. And then if you get to issues that are much less controversial. So for example, adoption. And this, I've seen numbers ranging on adoption from the low 50s to the low 60s, just depending on the question wording. And there are lots of states where adoption, just like with civil unions, is completely non-controversial. You know, 80% of people support gay and lesbian couples being able to adopt children. And then if you look at anti-bullying laws, you can see here that nearly three-quarters of people who attend religious services every week support laws that prohibit bullying against minority groups, including gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender children, or the children. I mean, look at that question wording, right? It's very heavily focused on gay couples and families and gay kids, and you can see that even among people who are very religious, almost three-quarters would support laws to prohibit bullying. And if you look at the intensity numbers, the dark blue, which is the strongly favor, you can see that those numbers, that there's a lot of intensity to support for those kinds of laws, with 55% of people who attend services every week saying they support them. If you look at ENDA, which is, laws that protect gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people from discrimination in housing, in employment, and public accommodation, you can see that 70% of people support those kinds of laws, and almost half support them strongly. And again, if you look across religious groups, ENDA is pretty non-controversial. This is just looking at a range of different religious groups, and if you look at observant Protestants, so those are Protestants who go to church every week, you can see 6% support. And religious Catholics, 81%. Support ENDA, and 74% of people who call themselves born-again Christians support ENDA. And what's also interesting is that when we talk about religious leaders using kind of LGBT issues politically and talking about LGBT issues, the vast majority of people agree. It says favor and oppose on here, but it should say agree, disagree, that it does more harm than good when religious leaders sort of talk about LGBT, issues or people. So you can, and again, across a range of religious groups. It's lowest among, religious Protestants, which includes obviously a lot of people who are evangelical or born again, but across a range of different groups, including, for example, religious Catholics, 84% say it does more harm than good. And that's a pretty interesting finding given the official position of the Catholic Church on LGBT issues, that religious Catholics actually think it does more harm than good when you talk about, gay and lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered people. So when you look at LGBT issues overall, what you see is a portrait of issues like civil unions, domestic partnership, and anti-bullying, non-controversial. Vast majority of people, support LGBT rights in this area. Adoption a little bit lower, but still majority support on adoption. And a lot of states where you don't have laws that allow, say, second-parent adoption, high levels of support for it. So I imagine in some places we'll start seeing laws that allow second-parent adoption. And then even on marriage equality, which really is the toughest, of all of the issues, you are getting to the point of people being split 50-50. And what's interesting, there's a few things that, things that are interesting about it. One is, how do you explain how rapid the change has been? Because again, when you look at core values questions, usually people don't change on them over the course of their lifetime. So usually what happens is there's something we call generational replacement. In other words, some people die and new people become adults and their attitudes become dominant. And so that's a little bit of what's happening, but the change is too rapid for that to be the only explanation for the change. Some of it, I think, has to do with pop culture. And, think about when Ellen, I don't know if you remember the Ellen show, not her sitcom, not her talk show, and she had the episode with Laura Dern where she, comes out of the closet. And it was, big deal. And then I was reflecting on that when I bought People magazine a couple years, which I do whenever I travel, because I have to stay in touch with the American people as a pollster. And there's it's the celebrity wedding edition, and there's a picture of Ellen DeGeneres and Portia de Rossi in a beautiful wedding dress, interspersed with lots of other celebrity weddings, with not even a comment about the fact that these are two women getting, married. They got married in that very brief period in California where gay marriage was legal. And I think they're grandfathered in. I think that's what happened after Prop 8 passed. So that's just kind of an unbelievable change in a very short period of time. And so when you think about Modern Family and you think about, whether it's entertainers or a range of other people who are kind of prominent in popular culture, being gay or being lesbian is just, really non-controversial. Really the only area left where I think that there's more squeamishness, if you will, is on transgendered people. And that's, definitely an area where people get nervous, for example, about ENDA because of public accommodation and issues of bathrooms and what have you. So that's really interesting. The second thing that's interesting is that the right has figured out that this is just an issue that isn't going to work for them long run. I mean, they had a period in the, again, around 2004 to 2006 where they had a lot of amendment battles in different states, and they used that to try to drive up turnout, though honestly there's very little evidence that those ballot initiatives actually increased evangelical turnout above what it would have been. So it's kind of an urban legend. We don't really have any evidence that it did. And there you have more and more, I think, prominent, conservative and leaders talking about this issue not being one that's has much shelf life for them. And there's prominent groups on the right, log cabin Republicans and a variety of other groups. You don't have a lot of the pro-choice Republicans are gone. There used to actually be some pro-choice Republican groups. They're just gone. That's actually the gay Republican groups are actually becoming increasingly prominent. The one issue I didn't mention or show data on, but it's interesting, is don't ask, don't tell. And again, that's an area where if you looked at public opinion in the early 90s when that policy first went into effect to now, there was a massive transformation, and the vast majority of people in this country supported ending don't ask, don't tell. And I actually did research on don't ask, don't tell with people in the military. And what was really interesting about that research was that there was a sense that it was inevitable. And as long as it came down the chain of command, they would do what they were told, because that's how the military works. And everybody who had all this concern about how people in the military are going to react to it, and the public opinion research we did, even if people were thought the policy worked and didn't want to end, at the end of the day, said, we're in the military, it's a chain of command, that's how it works here, we do. And so it was really interesting, and it's also interesting how little we've heard about it since it happened. So I would be, shocked if, LGBT issues played much of a role in the presidential election. There's been some controversy over some of the things Santorum has said, but I think Romney in particular, I still think he'll be the nominee. But as a Democratic pollster, I'm happy. I'm sorry, this is like a nonprofit 501c3 crowd. I won't express my opinion about Gingrich keeping this thing alive, but. But Romney, I think, is actually quite moderate on LGBT issues, and he's not somebody, even notwithstanding being a Mormon, I just don't see him talking a lot about it. But Santorum is certainly saying some pretty ugly things. But on the other hand, there are some really important ballot measures. So Minnesota, Washington will both have measures. The Republican legislature in Minnesota passed a constitutional amendment to outlaw gay marriage, and it will now go to the ballot. And that there's a Democratic governor, but the governor can't veto constitutional amendments. They can go straight to the voters. So he symbolically vetoed it, but he can't veto it. And then in Washington, as you probably know, the governor has actually come out in support of marriage equality, and it will likely pass the legislature, and it will immediately go to the ballot. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in those two states. There have been over 30 marriage initiatives, and they've all been lost. So the only one that ever won was in Arizona. It was a domestic partnership law. It included straight people. And because it included straight people, they ran an entire campaign around grandma and grandpa straight, as they call them. So, older people who don't get married for a variety of reasons, bound, say, Social Security benefits. And the legislature came back, 2 years later. And there was another amendment 2 years later that got rid of the straight people and just made it apply to gay people, and then it passed. So there was only one instance of winning this. There's also one more that's in North Carolina, and the one in North Carolina is interesting because gay marriage is already illegal in North Carolina. What this says is that it's a constitutional amendment that says there can be no recognition whatsoever in any shape or form of unmarried couples in any kind of relationship. And so that applies to domestic partnership, obviously, but it has it eliminates the domestic partnership benefits that Durham and other towns in North Carolina have. So it goes, it goes very far. It goes much farther than any of these have ever gone. So let me move to the issue of abortion. And abortion is quite different. And I think for a long time when people talked about social issues and electoral politics, they kind of lumped gay marriage and abortion together as, oh, those are the Christian right issues, and they use them to mobilize their members or their supporters and to get people out to vote. But it turns out they really aren't the same. Most importantly, as you can see from this chart, public opinion on abortion has not changed over time. And actually, there's an even better graph that Gallup has. They started asking about Roe versus Wade in 1973. And so they've got a trend line going back to when Roe versus Wade first was decided. And you can see, and these data are very similar, that a bare majority or plurality since the early 70s have been pro-choice, however you would define it. And there have been about 40 to 45% have been anti-choice, however you would define that. And it has had some, there have been some changes. It actually matters what happens in the national debate. So, for instance, you can see that at high points in kind of Democratic elections, you can see that there's a bump up in support. Also, you could see, like in '92, there was a bump up in support for choice when Clinton was elected. Clinton actually talked a lot about being pro-choice in the '92 election, and so did Gore in 2000. But they're pretty minor. They really don't. I mean, really, at the end of the day, it's very, very stable. And this is obviously, this is obviously an issue for both sides of the movement. Because you have, people who are on the pro-life side who are sort of quote-unquote winning in the sense of the kinds of laws that are passed at the state level. I believe after the 2010 election, there have been 900 anti-choice bills introduced in legislatures around the country, including one here that I believe the court lifted the stay on, is it an ultrasound bill? But there have been 900 of them, around the country, and of course what's happened in some of the more prominent debates in Congress associated with the health care reform bill. So on the one hand, I think on the pro-life side, they can feel very good legislatively about what they've been able to achieve, and yet, Roe versus Wade is still the law of the land, and public opinion really hasn't changed. Notwithstanding all these victories, you still have, a slight majority as sort of pro-choice. And the reason why I couch however you define pro-choice, because there are a lot of people who support a woman's right to choose with some exceptions, and some of those exceptions aren't acceptable to the pro-choice movement. So that person might think of themselves as pro-choice, but the kinds of exceptions that they would say, well, you shouldn't do it under these sets of circumstances. So for the pro-choice side, they would say that person's not pro-choice. So how you ask this question, how you define it, actually has a big impact on the results. This is just a recent, the most recent polling data that we could find. 56% say, abortion should be legal in all cases or legal in most cases. And again, the rub is what you mean by most cases, but very consistent with all the other data. And there are a bunch of areas on the abortion question where there is kind of what Gallup is calling, this is Gallup data, kind of policy consensus, where people who are pro-choice and pro-life basically agree. So, for example, should abortion be allowed when a woman's life is endangered? Almost 100% of pro-choice people say yes, and almost 70% of pro-life people say yes. And this actually, the abortion policy consensus actually speaks to the really important role that abortion plays sometimes in electoral politics. Because, and this was true, I'll give two examples from the 2010 election. It is very rare and unusual for anyone to sort of run on abortion, whether it's from the right or the left. It's not a defining issue in most elections. But someone's position on these issues can be a very important indicator of their values. And so it is not unusual in some races that I'm involved in, because I work for pro-choice Democratic women, for example, to get, pieces of mail to certain voters that says, candidate X supports abortion on demand up until the 9th month, et cetera. And it's also true on the other side that when a candidate opposes abortion, even in cases of rape and incest and life of the mother, that's a very extreme position. There's consensus that if the life or health of a woman is endangered, she should be able to have an abortion, or if she's become pregnant through rape or incest, she should be able to have an abortion. So, for example, if you look at the Colorado Senate race that was very close, Ken Buck, who was the Republican running in the Colorado Senate race in 2010, there were actually TV ads attacking his position on abortion, which, again, is very unusual. We don't tend to see ads, especially in states like Colorado, which aren't socially conservative states, so you don't have groups from the right running those kinds of ads. Basically, not so much because anyone thought that someone was going to be a single-issue abortion voter. It was that if Ken Buck opposes abortion in cases of the life and health of the mother and rape and incest, there's something wrong with his values. And that was also true in Gabby Gifford's race in 2010, running against a Tea Party Republican. The final ad of the campaign, and she won that race by 4,000 votes. I'm not suggesting this issue was the reason she won, but it was interesting that the final ad of a race that she won by 4,000 votes, very same issue, Jesse Kelly, the Republican running that race, opposed abortion in the case of rape, incest, life, and health of the mother. And that became, that was a campaign where Gabrielle Giffords, because it's a Republican-leaning district, would win by getting about 20% of Republican women and doing very well among independent women. And the choice issue was really important for that group. And there are a variety of races around the country. I could go on and on about other examples where the abortion for Democrats becomes an issue they use to their advantage to sort of say something about the values of the candidate they're running against, and similarly on the other side. So I'm working for somebody in this election year who did some work in reproductive health. And I have no doubt we're going to see ads that say, she supported, abortion on demand up into the 9th month. So, the other side does it as well. On the other hand, there's some areas of real conflict, and this is where the right has been successful legislatively and in the courts. But there's a set of issues, for example, around ultrasounds, parental consent. There's a whole range of issues. Actually, let me go back to this. I think one of the challenges for the pro-choice movement in some of the kinds of restrictions that have been passed at the state level is there's consensus on a bunch of these issues that can actually be quite burdensome for someone who's trying to get an abortion, but on their face they seem to be reasonable and they don't appear to be burdensome. So, for example, you can see parental consent for minors. 60% of people who are pro-choice agree with parental consent for minors. You can see 60%, agree with the 24-hour waiting period. And, as I'm sure everybody here knows, if there's one clinic in South Dakota where a doctor flies in once a week to perform abortions and there's a 24-hour waiting period and you have to have been counseled by that doctor, it makes it very difficult to actually get an abortion. Actually, that clinic just shut down, so there's no clinics in South Dakota because of that issue, because of the waiting period issue. So there's a range of issues where there is, even though we have a country that is bare majority pro-choice, there are a range of issues where there's consensus among people who are also pro-choice that actually introduce pretty significant restrictions, on abortion. Now, on the area of conflict, so this is really interesting to me because, first, there's a whole set of issues, a whole set of circumstances around which a woman might want to have an abortion where if you're pro-choice, you support that, and if you're anti-choice, you oppose it. So, for example, not being able to afford to have a child, or simply not wanting to have a child for any reason, but then also, first trimester. So if you're pro-life and you believe that life begins at conception, then obviously it doesn't matter to you what trimester it happens in. So opposing it in the first trimester, whereas people who are pro-choice support it in the first trimester. And then the other area where you have no consensus are some of the things that are a little more extreme. For example, conscience clauses, so that pharmacists don't have to fill birth control or morning after pill prescriptions. So these are areas of real conflict, and there's been some success and some failure on both sides in all these areas. One area that I would point out, which is an area of no consensus that's been a spectacular failure for the pro-life movement, has been personhood amendments. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a law that would say that at conception the fetus is a person and has all the rights that a person has. And therefore, there's a whole set of therefores. These are turned out to be, pretty challenging for the pro-life movement to pass these amendments. They introduced one in Colorado in 2008 and 2010, and you can see they failed spectacularly. Over 70% oppose these personhood amendments because, and the arguments that have been very successful for the people who are trying to beat back these amendments is that it can have all kinds of implications for in vitro fertilization, for example. So if you have some embryos that you're implanting and then you don't use them, they can't be destroyed, for example, or there's a whole range of different, and maybe even issues of contraception like the morning after pill, which prevents implantation, but if that, I guess, is a zygote at that point, is a person, then even preventing implantation, right, is killing a child. So in 2011, and there was, if you look at the last bullet here, you can see there's a lot of states where the pro-life movement is considering putting personhood amendments on the ballot. But if you look at Mississippi, and you probably remember this, this was actually an area where I think the pro-life movement thought they would win this because Mississippi is such a conservative state. And in fact, early polling had the pro-choice side losing. And I remember even talking to people at Planned Parenthood a couple weeks before saying, are we going to win? And we're like, oh, I don't know. And it was pretty shocking to almost 60% voted against it. But I think this is a case of, there were a number of things that happened in Mississippi, including Haley Barbour, who said, I'm going to vote for it, but I think it's a really bad idea. So if you can get your really popular Republican governor to say, I think it's a really bad idea because it may have all these unintended consequences, it might help you win in really conservative states, that's probably not a strategy you can use in every campaign that you run. But the point being is that, the pro-life movement can go too far, right? And personhood amendments is a place where they've gone too far. And I actually had actually submitted a proposal in Ohio to do work on the amendment there, obviously against it, and then they never got the signatures to get on the ballot because they were trying to do it right after Mississippi lost, and I think the resources sort of dried up for it after that. I would say that overall, if even though, so what you have nationally is a very consistent, over time, sort of modest majority supporting a woman's right to choose, but all kinds of support for all kinds of exceptions that if you are pro-life, you don't like, rape and incest, for example, and all kinds of support for exceptions that pro-choice people don't like waiting periods and parental consent. And I think that, there's almost a stalemate, quite honestly, I think, in this debate. But both sides can go too far. The pro-life movement has been much more aggressive for a lot of reasons, but they can go too far, and you can see that with personhood. But what I think overall, part of the challenge around abortion as a political issue, and part of the reason why it hasn't changed much over time, is that people are very ambivalent about it. So unlike, say, LGBT issues, where there's sort of a value around, for people who are pro-LGBT rights, there's a value around equality and equal treatment under the law, and there's some values-based reasons that you might support equality, and there's some legally based reasons why you might support equality, and there's some privacy issues around why you might support equality. And on the anti-side, there's also mostly religious-based and mostly focused on marriage at this point, because I do believe that the right has sort of basically conceded they've lost on every issue except for marriage, and it's very much driven by a kind of a notion that religion defines marriage as between a man and a woman. But there's a lot more ambivalence, and there's not a lot of ambivalence on LGBT rights, right? People know how they feel about it, and they're not ambivalent about it. Now, it's not true with abortion. There's actually a lot of ambivalence. There are a lot of people who are pro-choice who are very ambivalent about it. There's a lot of people who are pro-choice who say, I think a woman should have the right to choose, but I personally am against it. I personally think it's taking a life. And there are people, I've done focus groups with pro-life voters who, once you start having a conversation about the situations people could get into, like, well, if it was under those circumstances, then I think it would be okay for that person to have an abortion. And all of a sudden, they're carving out a set of, so there's a real kind of ambivalence around abortion. And I like this slide because I think it helps reflect that 46% say it's a sin and 44% don't. Just sort of people kind of divided. We don't have the intensity broken out on here, but there's tends to be more intensity on the anti-choice side than the pro-choice side, and more ambivalence on the pro-choice side than on the anti-choice side. But people basically divided on the question of whether or not abortion is a sin. But what's interesting is, like LGBT issues, there is a sense, at least in this survey, that it's wrong for leaders to try to pressure politicians on the question of abortion. I mean, that's a very specific question about abortion. People are less likely to say it's inappropriate, for example, for a religious leader to talk about abortion in general in church, especially Catholics who are religious and evangelicals, because they would say it's not a political issue, it's a religious issue. They would sort of say, we don't define it as political. But the notion that religious leaders should be pressuring politicians, actually people, denying communion to, candidates, for example, who are pro-choice, people, more hostile to that. And people, think it's quite possible to disagree with the teachings of your religion on the abortion issue, and you can still be a good Christian, Jew, Muslim, whatever, Baha'i, if you disagree on the issue of abortion. And that's absolutely true with Catholics. And in fact, if you look at Catholics overall, they look very much like the rest of America on abortion. They look like kind of the average American. About 52-55% are pro-choice if you look at Catholics overall. Obviously, if you look at religious Catholics, it's a bit different. And in all the focus groups that I've done with Catholics on LGBT issues, on abortion, in America, there's a real comfort with dissent from leadership of the Catholic Church. So, abortion is, I think, will continue to play, just like I think with LGBT issues, with ballot initiatives, potentially around the presidential election, though again, I think if Mitt Romney's the nominee, I think it ends up being pretty muted. But not as a driver, but really as kind of an indicator of candidates' kind of values, a heuristic that voters can use to say, do I agree generally with this person or not? Do I like them or not? So looking, at the 2012 election, when you ask people in deciding who you want to elect for president, what issues are going to be most important, not surprisingly, 56% of people say the economy. If you add the deficit to that, almost everybody's saying something that has to do with our financial situation in the country. That's not a surprise. But you can see abortion is down there at 3%, and that's a very typical finding in a survey like this. In periods where the economy is either growing or stable, social issues sometimes take on a more prominent role, but there isn't a question when there's war or there's a bad economy, these social issues really drop out as a driver. And when people are forced to choose, what's more important, your candidate's views on economic issues versus social issues? You can see 70% of people say their position on economic issues, 19% say social issues. Asked a different way, looking at kind of the salience of different issues. Again, it's a similar finding. People are asked to rate whether a certain issue would be a critical issue, one of many important issues, or not that important when it comes to voting. You can see the economy at almost 80% is a critical issue for people. Non-social issues like immigration, abortion, in the low 40s say it's a critical issue. And you can see on abortion and same-sex marriage, much less likely to say those issues are critical, and even a little less likely to say that they're important, among many issues. And you can see on the plurality in the case of abortion and a majority in the case of same-sex marriage say it's not that important. And here again, you can see this difference between abortion and same-sex marriage, that abortion is much more contested, I think, than same-sex, marriage is. And long-term, I think, will be more contested than same-sex marriage, particularly if those lines continue. Once those lines cross on marriage, right now they're just here, but when they cross, I think that will be even more obvious. Just going to say a few things, and again, I think there might be some overlap with the conversation you had with John Green earlier, so I'll do it quickly, and then we can go to Q&A. Religion, and obviously as religion is linked to these social issues. It's not the only reason why religion matters, but it's a big part of why religion matters in electoral politics, because there are such big religious differences on these social issues. So just to give you a bit of the lay of the land overall about what the country looks like, you can see that a majority of people in this country still identify as Protestant. That is declining, and there is an increasing number of people who are the nothings, people who say they're nothing, or they refuse, to answer the question. So that's 24%. You can see about 20% Catholic and about 2% Jewish. When you look among the Protestant population, you can see that a plurality are evangelical, fundamentalist, or charismatic. So if you add those three categories together, you get to 39%. 35% call themselves moderate to liberal, those are the mainline Protestants, the Methodists, the Episcopalians, and that, as you may know, is declining. So that the mainline Protestant population is declining. Just as the mainline Protestant population is becoming more democratic, it is declining. If you look, one of the things, though, when you think about the role of religion in politics is you have to look at the issue of race, because there really are really important, particularly when it comes to African Americans, but they're really important racial differences. So, first of all, African Americans are overwhelmingly Protestant. They're also overwhelmingly born again or evangelical, charismatic, Pentecostal. You can see that Hispanics, almost a majority, are Catholic, but there's a growing proportion that are Protestant, and many of them are Pentecostal. Some of that is from the mission work the Pentecostals do in Central and South America, and some of that is the work that happens in this country. Assemblies of God, which is the biggest Pentecostal denomination, has a very big Hispanic population. And this does have political implications over time. We could have a whole session on the future of the Hispanic vote. But there are two really important dynamics. One of them is generation, and whether or not you're born here and speak English, speak Spanish, and the other is religion. And if there's an increasing number of Protestants in the Hispanic population, it's not clear that that's a population that will continue to be as democratic as it has been. There's real differences by race and level of religiosity, the most important being that African Americans are the most religious group in this country. This is self-reported attendance. We know this is over-reported. There are studies where people actually count the number of people in pews on Sunday. And so about 40% of people in this country say they're going to church or religious services every week. It's probably 20 or 25%. But 85% of people say they vote in presidential elections, and we know it's 50%. So there's lots of issues where people, over-report socially desirable behavior. But overall, African Americans, much more religious. Hispanics actually look a lot more like Anglos around attendance. And as there are more and more Hispanics who are born in the U.S. and only speak English, they actually move farther away from the Catholic Church. So younger Hispanics religiously look more like any average young person, and their views around social issues like abortion and gay marriage look like any other young person, but they're significantly less economically populist or progressive than Hispanics who were born outside of the U.S. or are primarily Spanish-speaking. So it's an interesting dynamic. The thing I want to note about these numbers there are changes that are happening, but they're happening very slowly over time. So when I say that the proportion of mainline Protestants is declining, or the proportion of people who say they're nothing is increasing, that's happening, but it's not happening at an exponential rate. And it largely happens, there are two issues around religiosity. One is, what's your generation about? And the other is your stage in the life cycle. So for example, there's a big drop in religiosity when people leave home, and when they get married and have kids, it increases again. So you have to look at cohorts to really understand what's happening over time. So these data here are from the General Social Survey, and you can see this is looking at people under 30 in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the aughts. And what you can see over time is that there's an increase in the number of people, really you can see in the 90s and then in 2000s, among young people, and the percentage who call themselves unaffiliated. And that is coming, again, that's coming from the younger generation. So I expect to see these changes, the trends that we're seeing to continue, albeit slowly. There really are very distinct trends by religion. It's, if you're modeling the vote, religion, not so much denomination you belong to, but how religious you are and what your religious beliefs are is a very strong predictor of how you're going to vote, even after you control for ideology, even after you control for party. So you can see that Jewish voters and voters who are nothing are very Democratic. There's clearly an error in 2008 on the the no religion part of the slide. I apologize for that. That doesn't add. That's up to more than 100. I don't think it's 150%. The 72% number is right. Ignore the 75% number. So you can see people who are Jewish without religion, very Democratic. Protestants lean Republican, and you can see that Catholics are much more contested. So in 2006 and 2008, that were strong Democratic years. The Catholic vote broke Democratic. In 2010, which was a strong Republican year, it broke Republican. But here again is why the racial dynamic matters so much. If you look at white Protestants, they are very strongly Republican. So it's more muted when you look at the overall Protestant number. But when you take African Americans out, you can see that white Protestants are very, even in very strong Democratic years, are very Republican. White Catholics are more contested, but broke pretty heavily Republican in 2010. If you look at people without religion, you can see very Democratic, white people without, and then whiteboard again, 77% voted Republican in 2010. And then if you look at the numbers now, and this is where I'm going to stop and open it up for questions, if you look at the current presidential, and this is just looking at Obama against Romney, you can see the same trends are there. I mean, I don't really think that we're going to see the dynamics change fundamentally. Majority of Protestants say they're going to vote for Romney. Catholics are split. Jewish vote, which there's a big margin of error here, so that 57 is underrepresenting, I'm sure, the percentage of the Jewish vote that's going to go to Obama. And then 56% of people with nothing who say they're going to vote for Obama. And then if you break it out by race, you can see 62% of white Protestants for Romney, white Catholics leaning towards Romney, and then if you look at African American, Hispanic, you can see more Democratic. But I would just flag that Protestant Hispanic number there, where you can see that Protestant Hispanics are actually split evenly between Romney and Obama. And again, as that group grows, it potentially kind of changes the complexion of the Hispanic vote. So with that, I will stop, and I'll turn it over to you to organize the Q&A.
We are at the time when we said we would stop.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So if you'd like to have a few, take a few questions, but I think also some people may want to leave so that they don't head into 5 o'clock traffic. So if you would like
I won't think you're rude if you walk out.
If you'd like to go now, that's all. We thank you for coming. And Dr. Greenberg obviously is willing to stay a little while longer to deal with your questions for a while. So, and who's got the microphone? Is it on the, okay.
They're on the stands. ENDA, I'm sorry, that's a shorthand. I can't remember what it stands for, but it basically means the law that prohibits discrimination against LGBT people in employment, public accommodation, and housing. I think it's it's the Employment Non-Discrimination Act.
And speaking about ENDA, which is my question, I am a proud mother of a transgender son. And I've been working on ENDA, and we came so close to having Obama sign it. So close. What happened?
Well, I believe the transgender piece is the critical hang-up here.
Yes, it is.
I mean, the inside baseball answer is that I think some of the members of Congress who are gay who want to pass it, there's some dissension about whether or not you keep the transgender piece in or not.
Yes, that was.
And so that is the problem.
Okay.
I believe one of the members who doesn't want in there is retiring. So that may help get it in there, next time.
But it came so close, because I know that he was going to sign it. It was like one afternoon, and then all of a sudden the party changed, and it was Republican, and there was no way it was going to pass.
Right.
But Obama came so close.
I don't know. I don't pretend to understand his views. I believe he's probably pro-marriage equality and just won't say it. That's because, I can read his mind. But I do think that, so I don't pretend to understand how he thinks about these issues, but I will say that I think I think that progressives or Democrats, whatever, who are concerned about the transgender piece are misguided. I'm sure you know about Kalamazoo, but, every place where there's been an initiative around this, it's passed overwhelmingly with the transgender piece in it, in conservative places. So I think it's a fear that's not actually justified. And I actually have done some work, some experimental work in surveys where we include transgender in half the sample and don't have it in the other half. And it makes a little bit of difference, but it doesn't, maybe by 5 points, but it doesn't change the fact that the vast majority still support ENDA, even with the transgender piece in it. So it's a political calculation that's not actually based, I think, on where the voters are on it.
Kind of along that lines, my feeling has been that we've had a lot of Democratic candidates, and they make these calculations. They say, well, I'm for civil unions, but I'm against gay marriage, or, I'm for ENDA, but not with the transgender piece in it, or whatever. And I think what they fail to understand is that the people that are going to object to one are going to object to the other. And either you're going to stand up for what you believe in, or you might as well stand nowhere.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with that. I think that people I can only, putting on my hat as a political consultant, when I have clients and they say, I support marriage equality, I say, then say you support it. Because someone's going to ask you, and what are you going to say? Are you going to lie? Are you going to hedge? Are you going to fudge? Are you going to do a John Kerry and start your answer on, I believe life begins at conception, and then talk for 20 minutes, and somewhere in there he said he was pro-choice, but it wasn't ever clear what his actual position was. I think that's changing, though. First, I think public opinion is changing, and that makes politicians more brave around taking a progressive position on the issue. Also, generationally, the consulting class is changing, and there's a generational difference in consultants and how they advise candidates on these issues. So I think you're going to find more and more, even places that are tough, more, at least Democrats anyway, supporting marriage equality. And I think it's, when you start having the number of people who have come out and support, it's becoming less and less controversial. So I think it's going to change. Yeah.
Here,
I'd like for you to expound on your comment that there were no pro-choice Republicans. I'm still on an email list from the wish list of Republicans.
There aren't very many.
And expound on the reasons why you think that's going to either continue to diminish.
Right. Well, so I don't think the reason. I think the reason is it's an artifact of the loss of moderate Republicans in the party. So as more and more Republicans in, say, the Northeast or the Midwest, who are more moderate, many of whom were pro-choice, lost either to Democrats because they were basically Democratic seats, or lost in primaries to Tea Party candidates, there are fewer and fewer electeds who are on the Republican side who are pro-choice, and I think that there's a casualty of that. I don't think there was any concerted effort within the Republican Party per se to root out these pro-choice people. I think it is a function of the loss of moderate Republicans electorally.
A follow-up on that: Republican platform, as far as I can tell, wants government out of everything but the bedroom.
That's an observation.
One more question. You're already standing there, so we'll give it to you.
Your last slide and the one prior to that, you had lots of percentages, but you didn't have a composite of the end result.
Oh, where's the presidential election right now?
Yes.
It's tied with, it's been tied for a while with both, and so we've looked at it generically, we've looked at it with different Republican candidates. So generically, it's basically tied. Romney is the most competitive of all the Republicans. So when you put Obama against Gingrich or Bachmann or Perry, he had much 5 to 10 point leads over them. But it's been basically tied with Romney. Now in the last month or so, Obama's numbers have gotten better and Romney's have gotten worse, and so he's opened up a little bit of a lead against against Romney. But Obama's under 50, so when you have an incumbent under 50%, it says it's going to be a very competitive presidential race.
All right. Thank you all again for coming for the afternoon. Come back again. And thank you, Dr. Greenberg.